I hate flying. The whole experience is a paranoid exercise. There's nothing like a full body scan and a light fondling from an armed guard to prepare you to spend the next 11 hours breathing recycled air in a flying Pringles can. Even if you can shell out 5 figures for some additional leg storage and an edible meal, there's no escaping the stomach-flipping turbulence and the irrational fear that a skein of geese might hurl themselves into the engine. If only there was another, roomier, smoother way to fly that was also shaped like a giant inflatable penis.
It's Blimp.
Well, once upon a copyright expiration ago, before the Technicolor times, majestic airships graced the skies. The best way to fly, unless you wanted to be somewhere in a hurry or there was a moderate breeze. The brave floaters who first filled the air with these gigantic gas bags were forgotten pioneers who dared to dream the impossible. It's tragic then that today, airships are virtually an endangered species. Nearly all of them left to act as buoyant pop-up ads or heavy-handed motivation for Miami drug lords. An airship voyage is a rare thing this deep in the 21st century, which is why this month I've made it my mission to ride one.
Okay, you think anyone's ever painted one to look like a whale? That'd be quite good, like a little sky whale, a little beluga blimp.
But first, where did blimps come from? Long before the birth of blimps, the first age of lighter-than-air travel had already taken off and ploughed itself into the ground. All the best ideas start on paper, and in the case of human flight, this was quite literal. The Montgolfier brothers discovered that a paper balloon suspended over fire would fill up and float. After a few experiments and prototypes, the brothers arrived in Paris and met with King Louis XVI, where the brothers explained how they might lift a man into the sky. Always up for the possibility of some public bloodshed, King Louis suggested that 2 criminals be given the honor to ride Earth's first floating machine. Instead, a sheep, duck, and cockerel were sent soaring up 600 meters above Paris, escaping the surly bonds of Earth and the Paris piss smell for all of 2 minutes. The first human to fly, Jean-François Pilatre de Rosier, got an unparalleled view of the beginning of human aviation. The grand idea of getting higher than anyone had gotten before spread across the idle rich of France like brie across a farm labourer's scalp. Les Frères Robert built the first balloon that didn't choke you on smoke fumes, with the first hydrogen balloon in 1783. Their unmanned balloon flew for 15 miles before crashing into a French village, where it was attacked by peasants with pitchforks who believed it was the work of the devil. Only a few months later, the brothers flew themselves over 100 kilometers in a ship adorned with rowing oars which pointlessly swung at the airwaves. These early days of aviation moved quickly. Just 2 years later, the first human aviator again tried to make history by crossing the English Channel, only to be immediately blown back into France. Tragically, his half-hot air, half-hydrogen balloon ignited mid-flight, and Jean-François fell to his death on this exact spot, which would have been a lot messier if his memorial had already been built. Jean-François lost his life for the dream of flight. Over the next 50 years, balloon flight went from a spectacular sight to an urban irritant, with balloons bobbing up above London on a near-daily basis. Besides the antics of daredevils and professional animal droppers, the hot air balloon only really had one practical application: as an instrument of war. The French and Austrian armies first found use for hot air balloons, mostly against each other, but their power wasn't fully utilized until the American Civil War, where they were outfitted with telegraphic equipment so that balloonists could report on enemy positions from the clouds. In a very real sense, the Union Army's Balloon Corps was America's first ever Air Force. The ability to view the battlefield like they were playing a game of Age of Empires gave the Union a significant tactical advantage in many early skirmishes. They were piloted by a small team of civilian daredevils, including German-born aeronaut John Steiner, who had famously attempted to fly a balloon over Lake Erie in Canada. Time would inevitably forget Steiner and his death-defying stunt, and his most history-making flight must have seemed completely mundane at the time. In the last year of the Balloon Corps' active service, Steiner made a short tethered ascent as a demonstration for a visiting foreign dignitary, a German military officer and nobleman named Ferdinand von Zeppelin. Ferdinand von Zeppelin was a man with more self-belief than common sense. During his first balloon trip in 1863, he was already 10 years deep into a decades-long military career. In the Franco-Prussian War, he instigated a daring raid against the French that went deep behind enemy lines, where he bravely allowed his entire unit to be captured or killed. But as the sole uncaptured survivor of the raid, the press made him a hero of the newly united German state, while his military superiors saw him as a risk-taking head case. For the next few decades, von Zeppelin mostly forgot about his inspiring American balloon journey. But coincidence has an annoying habit of making history. During a routine exercise, von Zeppelin was thrown from his horse and hospitalized, where he came down with a life-threatening fever. His wife was with him when one night he woke up in a delirium, ranting about flying machines and ocean liners in the sky. Top military brass took the opportunity to finally brush him off, suggesting him for an early retirement. While his career crashed, von Zeppelin inherited the title of Count and hundreds of thousands of Deutschmarks from his recently departed father. So the 52-year-old left the military with a fortune and looked to the skies for a late-in-life career change and a second chance at glory. The Count's delayed arrival to aviation would turn out to be exceptional timing. When the Count threw his spiky helmet into the ring, others had already spent decades trying and failing to control balloons in mid-air, allowing technology and industry to catch up with the Count's delusional ambitions. Combustion engines had gotten lighter and a lot more efficient, and two new methods of creating aluminium at industrial scale were developed independently of each other in the 1890s. By 1900, von Zeppelin had spent a sizable chunk of his family's fortune to build his first working prototype, the LZ-1. The size and sausage-like shape of the craft initially only brought ridicule, especially from the journalists who witnessed the craft's first and only flight. On the failed launch of its successor, a newspaper wrote that his pathetic obsession had only led him to squander his fortune and destitute his family. Though one journalist was kinder to von Zeppelin than the others. A 32-year-old named Hugo Eckener goofed on Zeppelin's creation, but applauded the man for his high-flying dreams. Days after publishing the piece, Eckener would wake up to the sound of the Count himself knocking on his doorbell repeatedly with a walking stick. And after a brief conversation, Eckener would agree to do part-time publicity work for von Zeppelin's company. Hugo Eckener didn't know it at the time, but he'd just taken his first step to becoming the greatest airship captain that history would ever know. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Atlantic, some hayseeds in North Carolina had successfully flown and broken the world's first fixed-wing aeromoplane, a rare achievement among a sea of Carnival Act aviators attempting to master heavier-than-air flight. Like that'll catch on. Just one Zeppelin later, the Count and the giant penile shadows he cast over provincial German towns became a symbol of national pride. The LZ-3 was a roaring success, staying in the air for 2 whole hours and taking 11 people up for the ride. Mirroring his military career though, Count von Zeppelin's death-defying failures often brought him more acclaim than his achievements. When the LZ-4 exploded in mid-flight, the spectacle of its shattered skeleton appeared all over the newspapers. But this inspired a crowdfunding campaign which raised 6 million marks for von Zeppelin's further experiments. No longer blowing his children's inheritance, von Zeppelin now spent the German people's money on Zeppelins, and spent his golden years flying them. He experimented with size and shape, mostly deciding that bigger was better, dwarfing those puny planes that could barely stay in the air for more than a few minutes. The 60-year-old also spent his time training a host of new pilots, including his longtime publicity man, Hugo Eckener, who turned out to be a talented pilot as well as a savvy businessman. Airships could fly thousands of feet higher than airplanes, so the Count could figuratively and literally look down on them. As he got older though, his vision got narrower, and he was probably going a bit senile.
My Zeppelins will rule the world!
He became obsessed with leading a fleet of Zeppelins for the military that had rejected him 20 years ago. He dismissed Hugo Eckener and others when they span off from the Zeppelin company to found the first ever passenger airline. Customers rode in style on eye-wateringly expensive domestic flights between German towns on DLAG's small fleet of airships. Passengers on Earth's first airline would fly and only occasionally crash in world-class luxury. Meanwhile, the Count's ego was inflated to bursting point as he convinced the government to invest in a fleet of war-ready Zeppelins. And as usual, the Count's timing was top-notch, because a war was just around the corner. A great one. Are you tired of staring into the hungry abyss of an empty fridge, or of late-night shopping trips for missing ingredients where you have no idea who's fondled them first? In that case, look no further than HelloFresh. Fit and wholesome recipes that make it easy to eat well without sacrificing flavour, so you can maintain your goals and feel good about your food choices. Foolproof step-by-step recipes mean a joyful cooking experience and a stress-free summer. Plus, HelloFresh saves time in the kitchen with meals ready in around 30 minutes or less. HelloFresh has over 30 dinner recipes to choose from every week. That's more choices than any meal kit on the market. This week I'm having sea bass. HelloFresh is the first carbon-neutral meal kit company, and nearly all the packaging is recyclable. With its huge variety of recipes, it even allows me to please the picky and most important vegetarian in my life. Go to HelloFresh.com and use my special code OrdinaryThings16 to get up to 16 meals completely free and free surprise gifts, one of which might include chocolate, so what are you waiting for? HelloFresh.com. By the beginning of World War I, Germany had 11 airships ready to fly, including 3 that it had yanked from Hugo Eckener's commercial airline. Against all odds and his own ailing health, Count von Zeppelin saw his wildest dreams come true. Over the 4 years of the war, over 93 Zeppelins were built by the German military. These high-flying, bomb-dropping mega balloons scared the shit out of Londoners when they arrived above the city in the second year of the war. And they were even more successfully used by the German Navy to scout out enemy positions. But after a year of inaccurate and infrequent European bombing campaigns, a British airman named Willie Robinson became the first man to shoot a Zeppelin down. Thousands of Londoners watched from their homes as searchlights illuminated Willie's single plane during its hour-long climb to meet the SL-11 in mid-air. Willie then fired a series of incendiary bullets of his own design, piercing the Zeppelin's many gas bags and igniting it from within. Londoners watched in disbelief as the giant German sausage barbecued in mid-air and lit up the night sky, while each member of the SL-11's crew were forced to choose between falling or burning to their death. Willie Robinson was awarded the Victoria Cross for his Zeppelin-bursting bravado, and the Flying Corps became national heroes. By the end of the war, airplanes were able to climb to the same heights as Zeppelins, though wing flight was still a lot riskier. The average life expectancy of a World War I pilot was about 3 weeks. Willie Robinson fared a little better, flying for another year before being shot down behind enemy lines and spending the rest of the war as a prisoner. He did eventually make it back to Britain at the end of the war in 1918, where he was eventually finished off by the influenza pandemic a couple months later, which is really the lost generation's experience in a nutshell. Meanwhile, the original human Zeppelin suffered a similar fate as his military fleet, as his own internal gas bags succumbed to a nasty case of pneumonia. Count von Zeppelin died a national hero, and as usual, his timing was impeccable, as nearly all 93 of his inflatables had drowned, burnt, or blown away by the end of the war. When Germany surrendered, the military was forced to dismantle any airship they had left under terms agreed in the Treaty of Versailles. Hugo Eckener campaigned fiercely to keep some for civilian service, but failed to save any from the scrapyard. The mighty airship had proven in the war that it could stay in the sky for days at a time and travel thousands of miles at a smooth pace. The L-59 performed a continuous 95-hour flight during the war. Commercial airplanes, meanwhile, could only handle a small payload and were a lot less comfy, having the tendency to shake harder than a mistreated washing machine. Airplanes spent the rest of the 1920s getting better, mostly by trial and error. The next generation of passenger airships were built with scale, style, and comfort in mind. not to compete directly with airplanes, but with ocean liners. This led people to logically predict a future where planes and airships would share the skies. While it didn't quite work out like that, I was determined to manifest this future in 2022, at least for myself. Look, it's a blimp! Although that isn't quite accurate. It's actually a rigid airship, one of only about 5 in the whole world. And we're gonna ride it, so I'm real excited. Goodyear has been making these airships since all the way back in 1925, and it is really the only company that is keeping the dream of inflatable flight alive. This airship, though, is not like Goodyear's airships of old. It sports these aluminium and carbon fibre trusses which hold 3 vectored engines. Now, I don't really know what that means, but what it essentially lets it do is land and float in midair, much like a helicopter, but except, you know, it's much bigger and way cooler. So if you're like me and you have trouble telling what's a blimp and what's an airship, the trick is to look for the propellers. If they're on the side of the big balloon thing, then it is an airship. If it's on the gondola, then it is a blimp. So if you see a big floating sky sausage in the sky and you're not sure, check for the propellers. Haven't had to go through airport control. I mean, I don't have any liquids on me, but I'm sure I could bring them on if I like. So far, this is far superior to any airport experience I've ever had. So what's your role specifically?
Crew member.
You're a crew member, okay. How long have you been doing this? 6 years. Ooh.
Welcome aboard.
Are you ready to float? I think I am, although I'm not particularly steady on my feet right now. Nice big windows, lots of space. I don't know much about blimp flight, so the joystick you use it to move them forward and backward. If you wanted to take this full tilt and go as fast as possible, how fast can we go? Can we break the speed limit?
120.
120 miles an hour? Kilometers?
Kilometers.
Feels very odd to be floating and then also be able to like see the ground. We're currently off the ground, but only by about 2 meters, so... Truly, airship flight is the height of luxury. I mean, I've got more leg space than you could ever get on even the highest of first-class flights, and we're floating right now. Technically, not quite in the sky, but blissful floating on the Goodyear. No waiting around, no people jostling with their luggage, and no waiting on the tarmac. It's just one jump, and you're off. Airplanes beat that! By 1920, the Goodyear Tire Company had already made a fortune by putting rubber on the road. So it only made sense that their next move was to put blimps in America's skies. Goodyear Vice President Paul Litchfield acquired designs and engineers on the cheap from the ailing German Zeppelin company. That way he could construct Goodyear's first fleet of plump, promotional blimps. Mostly used to spread the good name of Goodyear, they earned the love of the American people by showering them with free stuff. Litchfield was so pleased with his success that he spearheaded a collaboration with the German Zeppelin company to bring rigid airships to the States. And this was great news for Hugo Eckener, who had already convinced the US to accept some of Germany's war reparations back in Zeppelin form. He personally piloted the airship Los Angeles to America on its 81-hour delivery flight, and it would become the US Navy's longest-serving airship, because, well, the other 3 crashed. For example, the USS Akron was probably the most cursed airship to ever sail the skies. A source of oversized American pride, the Akron was the first ever flying aircraft carrier, and the biggest floating thing ever at the time of its construction anyway. But its helium load and jumbo size meant it was extremely sensitive to the winds, like here when a slight breeze gave it an unexpected cesarean. Just 3 months later, the extra-large airship was at the end of a coast-to-coast journey when it attempted to moor in San Diego. As an untrained ground crew attempted to bring the ship down, the helium inside was heated by the Californian sun, making the gas significantly lighter and the ship extremely sensitive to an upward gust. Most of the mooring crew were able to escape, but 3 unlucky and unwilling aviators were taken on a nightmare voyage from which only 1 survived. This moment was later recreated in the James Cagney film Here Comes the Navy, with a happier ending stapled on.
Can you hang on another minute? Well, it ain't flatfoot. I might have guessed it. The only guy in the Navy dumb enough to hang on the end of a rope. Going down too fast to suit me. Hope we make it, Kent.
Later on, the Navy's premier airship encountered severe fog and weather off the coast of New Jersey. After suffering extreme turbulence, the Akron crashed into the sea, leaving its 73 crew members to drown or expire from hypothermia. A Navy blimp was sent out to join the search for survivors and also crashed, adding 2 more men to the accident's death toll. The Akron's demise was actually the deadliest airship crash in history. But because the crash and its wreckage were never recorded on film, it's largely been submerged in the tides of history. Its sister ship, the USS Macron, wasn't quite as accident-prone, but it too was lost off the Californian coast in 1935. The precedent of the Akron's crash, though, meant that crew members were provided with life jackets, and nearly everyone on board was saved. Though this was the end of the airship's American naval career. After the war, Hugo Echner was at a loss. He'd inherited a Zeppelin company that didn't have any Zeppelins. Ever persistent though, he directly lobbied the German president to build more Zeppelins. Another military hero named Paul von Hindenburg. And I can imagine you can guess where this is going. Echner explained his designs for an even bigger Zeppelin. One that would make all the old ones look like floating Frankfurters. Hindenburg granted Echner a few million Deutschmarks, while Hugo made deals with America and bled the profitable parts of his business dry. In just a few years, Echner would personally fly the greatest airship that would ever fart through the sky. LZ-127 is singular in aviation history. Better known as the Graf Zeppelin, it achieved 9 years of fatality-free service and facilitated the first ever passenger service across the Atlantic, beating any airplane service by nearly a decade. On board the Graf Zeppelin, 24 passengers could fly to America in private cabins and would dine on creamed chicken soup and all the German beer they could drink, before retiring to the lounge for a stable game of chess. Although there was no bath, so they arrived in America stinking of a week's worth of sweat and hangovers. Echner wrote at the time that the Graf Zeppelin experiment would lead to either victory and fame or the final downfall and the end of a defective concept. And the next decade would pretty much bring all of those things in that exact order. Still, Echner spent the next decade serving as the captain on all of the Graf Zeppelin's major flights. On the Graf's first arrival in the States, he was greeted by a crowd of 150,000 people, who clogged the road with traffic just to get a glimpse of the enormous ship. New York treated the aviator to its largest ever ticker tape parade, and even planned to let passengers disembark at the top of the Empire State Building. At home, the Graf Zeppelin was celebrated across the political spectrum, although it was particularly enjoyed by nationalists who saw it as a source of German pride when there wasn't a whole lot to be proud about. In 1929, he took the beast on a round-the-world journey, which was an astonishing feat of diplomacy as well as aviation. Echner cast the Graf Zeppelin shadows over the whole of Europe, and even got Stalin to agree to a full Russian flyover. He did refuse to land in Russia during the trip because of adverse weather conditions, which would end up really aggravating Stalin. Echner was famous for his abundance of caution. He would only fly in the most favourable conditions and would drive his crew crazy with safety check after safety check, which partly goes to explain the Zeppelin company's unrivaled safety record when compared to any other airship company that was around at the time. After being given a rare audience with Emperor Hirohito of Japan, Echner made it across the Pacific and back to New York, where he was treated to yet another ticker tape parade. Even so, the round-the-world trip wasn't without incident. At one point encountering a high-altitude storm, the Graf was forced to land in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Meanwhile, in the now times, we were struggling to even get off the ground. We are being told that perhaps the weather is not good enough to take the blimp on board, so my dreams of blimp flight may be put on hold for now, but we're going to find out. I live in hope. So what is the issue with the weather?
It's the wind. It's not the wind on the ground, it's the wind up there.
I see. Still, I was determined to make my blimp dreams a reality, so decided to take it up the chain of command with the blimp captain herself.
I mean, help us out here. Yeah, so it's very...
There's a lot of blimp bureaucracy.
There is, yes.
So we've been told that, sadly, we cannot fly today. Kate, could you explain to us
why?
Why aren't we allowed? Why aren't we allowed up in the sky?
It's not that you're not allowed. Zeppelins are relatively, for aircraft, slow moving.
basically, I don't know if you saw earlier, when I was sitting in it, it just lifted itself up, one big gust, and it just lifted itself up, and it moves from side to side. The problem with that is if you start trying to take passengers in those conditions when it's on the ground and you've got people climbing up the ladder, and at the time when they're climbing up the ladder, it goes really fast sideways, or it lifts, God forbid, it lifts into the air. We have a safety record of 100% since 2001. We don't actually want to break it, and we don't want to hurt anyone, and that's why we say at 20 knots on the ground, which is forecast to be gusting 20. The reason it's not quite so windy here is because we've got this hill.
I see, okay.
Yeah.
You have to make a noise, it's not how you feel right now, what we're down with.
Oh, the humanity. The British airship industry was about as short-lived and successful as the leadership of another bloated British failure full of hot air. Sorry, I couldn't help myself. After nearly a decade of slow building, 2 British airships that were worthy competitors to Germany's gigantic offerings finally took off. The biggest of which was His Majesty's airship, the R-101, which inflated in 1929 and was the largest flying craft in the world, just about beating the Graf Zeppelin, if only in terms of girth, with 50 passenger cabins and a lounge spread out over 2 decks. Britain hoped it would be the first in a fleet of airships that would unite its empire. So it set out on its first voyage to Karachi, where the R-101 was set to show the world what British balloons could do. Though the enormous and overweight airship only made it to the north of France, before it lost altitude, crashed and caught fire, killing 48 of the 54 passengers on board.
When we arrived there, we found the ship going up in flames, and we rushed through the fields on foot. So the first man we took was Church. He was wounded. My friend took him to the hospital. Then the second man I got was Leach, an engineer, and we found the other 2, Biggs and Bell, coming out of the thing. It was rather funny side and cruel side.
The embarrassment of the tragedy swiftly put an end to any further British airship ambitions, and the twisted aluminium waste of the R-101 skeleton was eventually sold for scrap to Germany, where it was repurposed for Eckener's next great project, and probably the only Zeppelin you knew about before watching this video. Disaster was looming for 1930s Germany in more ways than one. Hyperinflation had wrecked the German economy, and the Nazi Party was wrestling its way into power. The aging President Hindenburg at this point was little more than a figurehead, and the country was in such dire need of leadership that at one point Hugo Eckener was proposed as a serious unity candidate for president, though Hugo was far too busy building Zeppelins to seriously contemplate squaring up against the recently appointed Chancellor, Adolf Hitler. LZ-129 took its first official flight on March 4, 1936, 2 years after the original human Hindenburg's internal gas bags had succumbed to cancer. Yes, I used that joke twice, but when history repeats itself so flagrantly, I don't see why I can't either. Hitler combined the roles of president and chancellor and declared himself Führer, which was bad news for everyone, but also specifically for Hugo Eckener. Over the years, Hugo had publicly criticised the Nazi Party and was even briefly arrested by them in 1933. Hitler reportedly hated Eckener and wanted to eliminate the Hindenburg, and not just because its name ended in Berg, but he did recognise that both of them were useful as propaganda tools. Ultimately, Eckener decided that he loved Zeppelins more than he hated Nazis. He accepted 6 million marks in public money from Joseph Goebbels' propaganda ministry and continued to live a comfortable life in Germany even during the war. The Graf Zeppelin and the Hindenburg were co-opted by the regime, appearing together at the 1936 Olympics, freshly graffitied with fascist geometry. As the Nazis solidified their control over the company, they stripped Eckener of any real power. He no longer called the shots at the Zeppelin company, and he was rarely ever able to fly the Hindenburg himself. For the rest of the ship's commercial life, he was replaced by Captain Ernst Lehmann, a wartime airship captain and Nazi Party panderer. Lehmann was also a lot less risk-averse, at one point skipping test flights and flying in unfavourable conditions just to accommodate a propaganda flight for Hitler. In doing so, he damaged the great ship's swastika-covered fin in a case of foreshadowing that even a Hollywood screenwriter would balk at. And it really is such a shame that the Hindenburg fell into the hands of the Nazis and Lehman, because it was a one-of-a-kind marvel, both as a ship and as a spectacle. So let's look at it in both those ways. For contemporary flyers, it's hard to visualize just how enormous the Hindenburg was. Now, of course, most of that length was made up of its mostly inaccessible aluminium skeleton, but its passenger space was still a sight to behold. Here, in some rarely seen footage taken by a family on a sightseeing trip, we can see what it was like to fly on the Hindenburg during its first and only year of transatlantic service. Either side of its 50-bed passenger cabins were a writing room, a passenger lounge, and a fancy 47-foot dining room. To keep the Hindenburg afloat, anything that could be made of aluminium was, including the lounge's mini grand piano, made from the lightweight metal and covered in pigskin. And here, and I love this, we can hear exactly what it sounded like in this eerie staged footage taken while the ship was docked in the New Jersey Naval Station, where it would later meet its demise. If you were alive to see this enormous, gravity-defying structure circle the Empire State Building in 1937, it must have seemed like a miracle. But if you could afford a $450 ticket, which is about 10 grand in today times money, you might have noticed some of its drawbacks. By 1937, aeroplanes were nearly ready to zip commercial passengers across the Atlantic for a lot less money and in a fraction of the time, and you didn't arrive smelling like a foot. Still no shower on the Hindenburg, but there were plenty on the ocean liners that it was still in direct competition with for long-haul Atlantic journeys. And you could cram hundreds of people on them, along with on-board entertainment, half-decent food, and, ship-bound romance options. No one was getting painted like no French girl on the Hindenburg's cramped cabins. And while it took an iceberg to take down the Titanic, all it took for the Hindenburg was a single static shock.
It bursts into flames. Get it started. It's fighting, and it's crashing terrible. Oh my, get out of the way, please. It's bursting into flames, and it's falling on the mooring fast, and all the folks believe that this is terrible. This is one of the worst catastrophes in the world. Oh, it's like 400 or 500 feet into the sky, and it's a terrific crash, ladies and gentlemen. The smoke and the flames now, and the flame is crashing to the ground, not quite to the mooring mast. All the humanity and all
the moment the Hindenburg anchored in New Jersey on the 6th of May, 1937, it would loom larger as a tragedy than it ever would as a feat of engineering. It wasn't the first airship disaster, nor was it the deadliest, but it was the first disaster of its kind to be recorded on camera and shown on the newsreels. And the journalists who gathered to witness its mooring quickly understood the magnitude of their colossal scoop. "37 people lost their lives, including 22 crewmen, 13 passengers, and a single ground fatality. Though there were 62 survivors, which can seem surprising when we see the scale of the fireball 100 years later. One survivor was Werner Franz, a 14-year-old boy who was saved from the flames when a water tank above him burst. His mother and brother also survived, but the rest of his family perished. And when he died, so too did the final first-hand account of the Hindenburg disaster that was uninfluenced with viewing it as a media spectacle. And that's what I find so interesting about the Hindenburg. If you'll allow me to get a little conceptual for a minute, Karl Marx said that all great world historical facts appear twice, first as tragedy, then as farce. A quote that is pretty much proven by this finger puppet I have of the man himself. Seize the means of production, comrades, yippee! And it's true of the Hindenburg as well. The echo of the tragedy can be heard in direct retellings, but then also in dozens of cartoons from the 1990s onwards.
I chose the Hindenburg flipbook series. Cool.
Ugh! I have got to get to the buffet before we land!
These, they're pretty cool.
To the Hinden, Peter!
The Hindenburg exploded right at the beginning of the age of mass media, where images could first be repeated, distorted, and disseminated so easily that images could become more significant than the events that they actually depict. And it's this uniquely modern distortion that makes this recently unearthed footage so interesting. Shot by an amateur filmmaker, we can actually see behind the iconic image for the first time, closer to where the fire began, and maybe closer to a reality that has been distorted by time and media. Captain Ernst Lehmann also escaped the crash, but with burns all over his upper body and severe ones on his back. He was taken to the hospital where he spoke deliriously of an explosive device on board. And when he died, he was buried in what I believe is the only recorded Nazi funeral to ever take place on North American soil. Like the monumental media disasters that followed it, the fate of the Hindenburg was subject to a host of conspiracy theories and rumors. This is the thing about grand spectacles. They inspire shocking stories that live up to their shocking emotional effect. While Hugo Echner would later blame Lehmann's hasty landing for the eventual disaster, the likelihood is that it was an accident caused by a hydrogen leak and a few other fortuitous technical faults. But as we already know, coincidence has an annoying habit of writing history for us. As the conclusion of the First World War ended the first age of Zeppelins, the beginning of the Second World War pretty much polished them off for good. The only place you could get helium at the time was in the US, and no one really fancied their chances boarding a skybound hydrogen bomb. The American wing of the Goodyear Zeppelin company severed all ties with their German collaborators, and even used their blimp building powers to fight the Nazis. When Germany was defeated and the rest of Europe was reduced to a few piles of rubble and a wine cellar, America became the de facto home of airship construction. Goodyear bought back many of the blimps it had built for the war effort and converted them for civilian use. The company even proposed plans in collaboration with Hugo Echner to build a Hindenburg Beta, a 10 million cubic foot monster that never left the drawing board. Echner's old age and Nazi connections put a stop to any future airship projects, so he retired to his hometown, where he died remembered fondly by those who still did. People sure remembered the Hindenburg though, so they didn't really want to ride blimps, but they still loved looking at them. For the next 50 years, Goodyear would keep the dream of giant inflatable flying things alive, and even found practical uses for them beyond blimpy brand awareness. Since the 1960s, Goodyear blimps were used to capture aerial footage of sporting events like the US Open. Goodyear's presence at sporting events would forever associate blimps with good times in 20th century America. Their always improving capacity to put words in the sky have kept people craning their necks and shielding their eyes from the sun to behold their plump grandeur. The Goodyear blimp in Florida was even used to spread emergency information during floods and communication blackouts back in the 1990s. The Goodyear blimp is an iconic piece of Americana, cemented by the fact that around 20 Americans every year use the Goodyear as target practice, but a few puncture wounds aren't enough to keep a good blimp down. Riding the Goodyear blimp is actually a invitation-only privilege, which I begged very nicely for. And it's only because of Goodyear that blimps have stayed in the public consciousness for so long, although recently they have been outsourcing their construction to a familiar name. In the 1980s, the Zeppelin company rose from the ashes like some obese, slow-moving phoenix. It is a testament to the airship legacy that modern companies are still trying to reinflate them to this day. Bloodthirsty military contractors Lockheed Martin attempted to blow new life into the airship back in the 2000s, although these remained experimental or just conceptual designs. The British company Airlander made some ill-fated attempts more recently, resulting in their only test vehicle plunging to the ground in the slowest air crash ever committed to film. No! 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 No one was hurt. I don't know what to say. It's floating, it's got no wings, it's unnatural, it scares me. But I'm ready. I'm ready to face my fears of wingless flight. It's big, it's chunky. The few remaining airships are kind of an echo of a time where flight was still a fanciful idea rather than a modern chore. Their slow pace is why they were eclipsed by planes, and yet while riding one, that's exactly what reconnects you with the wonder they must have first inspired. We live in an age of wonders that would make a Victorian farm labourer shit themselves in abject horror at the alien world that they've been unnaturally forced to behold. It's comforting for us to see progress as a single, straight line, taking us forever upwards to a higher, better place. Oh look, a cul-de-sac! The shadow looks sort of ominous, to be honest, but like a slow-moving missile or a poo. But history is deceiving. It's mostly a record of successes and horrific spectacles which erase the lifetime of labour and unsexy failures that got us here.
It is weird being at this angle, being so close. I do feel a little bit like I'm playing SimCity, but, you know, in a majestic, incredible kind of way. There's the shard, and I'd be lying if I wasn't a little nervous about being in what is essentially a giant balloon next to a massive sky needle. But, you know, that's the risks you run when you're blimping, baby. Straight blimping.
Progress isn't a straight line. It's a tangled mess of interlinking strands. And that is the lesson of the blimp. It's a humbling reminder from days gone dead that every success and innovation owes its existence to a parade of forgotten failures. And I guess, well, I just think that's really cool. Oh, and before you go, I've got some exciting news. I have written a comic book for all of you, and it's going to be coming out soon. If you want to know more about it, follow me on Twitter. I'll look at Patreon, where there'll be some like exclusive goodies coming soon. And you know what? Here's the front cover. It's going to be great. It's called This Sweet Cesspool. I can't wait to show it to you. More details in the next video. Peace out.
Hey there, blimpy boy, flying through the sky so fancy free.